Technically, this is the beginning of our state president's council meeting and elected officers. Historically, we wanted to have our state presidents from the various state affiliated states come together at the same time that our association executives are coming together for ongoing training and education. And we try and do this once or twice or three times a year, at least with our AECs. So officially, Dan Reel is the chairman of the State President's Council. And by name, people think, well, I can't go to the State President's Council meeting because I'm not a state president. But the idea and the thinking behind the State President's Council meeting is to allow for continuity at the state level for all incoming officers, for all up-and-coming officers who may be a vice president this year or a senior vice president next year, or you may be the treasurer this year, and at some point you may be ascending to the role of president or chairman. So in an effort to just create some of that continuity at the state level, we started having, and this was an idea that Mike came up with a few years ago, or a number of years ago, is to start having the association executives meet at the same time the state presidents and our elected officers are meeting. So technically, that's what this meeting is today. So officially, Dan, I don't know if you want to call the meeting to order or whatever, but we'll go ahead and get started.
Go ahead.
Motion to start the meeting. Okay, second. So we've got an esteemed panel up here this morning. We've got Mike Lynn, Dan Reel, Henry Mullinax, and Sean Peterson, all gathered today in an effort to just talk about some of the most fundamental, basic things that we see flare up at the state level from time to time. So, and it's interesting because whenever we have new executive directors or people at the state level who get hired, at our expense, at NIADA expense, we will fly them to the NIADA offices for 2 to 3 days worth of association training. And we talk about the relationship that the NIADA has with our state associations. We talk about the affiliation agreement. We talk about membership. We talk about communication. We talk about our magazines, our conventions, fundraising, I mean, we cover the whole gamut. But inevitably, at the end of the day, if you don't have a channel through which all of your cash and all of your expenses can flow through with proper accounting and proper accountability, you've got nothing. Well, let me back up. You do have something. You're choking down a whole lot of liability as board members, specifically as treasurers, vice presidents, presidents, and the whole thing. So we thought this morning we would take a little bit of time to just talk about that concept in general, because the panel that we have up here today has seen a lot of the horror stories at the state level about mismanagement of funds, inaccurate reporting of financial statements, and the like. So we figured we'd take a few minutes this morning, talk about some of the basic red flags that you may see at the state level, and keep in mind, we understand that across the country, our state associations are at a number of different places along their life cycle. You've got some state associations that have been around for 40, 50 years. You've got some state associations who've been around for 10 or 15 years. And the life cycle at the state level varies greatly. So if you guys in your state, you're thinking back saying, oh man, we get monthly financial reports, we're airtight, we do audits every year, that's a great place to be, but you don't want to get complacent. So you want to think about things that you can point to or think about or just acknowledge to give yourself peace and comfort, knowing that your financial condition and the financial reporting is accurate. So with that, I'm going to kick it off to Sean and have Sean talk a little bit about the role and responsibility of the board members and each of that stuff. And before Sean goes, let me just say, this is a meeting and an opportunity for you. I mean, we could sit up here all day and tell you war stories and horror stories about things that we've seen, but this is a forum for you guys to really ask questions, to engage the panel. We've got attorneys, we've got dealers, we've got association management, we've got leaders up here who want to be a resource for you. So anyway, Sean?
So Steve asked me to kind of give a little bit of the legal background behind fiduciary duties and responsibilities that members of the board have. And as I was thinking about that particular topic, I thought of my 5-year-old. And my 5-year-old is our youngest, and he is the probably most inquisitive of the children we've ever had. So we feel like we get the question of why every 10 minutes. And I thought perhaps the why is what we need to talk about today. I am a history buff. I studied history in college, and I love Alexis de Tocqueville and his journey to America in the 1830s. This is a quote. I hope you can see that all right. One of the observations that he made about America is that Americans come together and form associations of different types, whether it be religious, whether it be for entertainment purposes, whether it be for a common interest like a business interest. But I love this idea here. Americans of all ages, all conditions, and dispositions constantly form associations. They have not only commercial and manufacturing companies in which all take part, but associations of 1,000 other kinds: religious, moral, serious, futile, general or restricted, enormous or diminutive. The Americans make associations to give entertainments, found seminaries, build inns, construct churches, diffuse books, send missionaries to the antipodes. In this manner, they found hospitals, prisons, and schools. And then skip down there. Wherever at the head of some new undertaking you see the government in France or a man of rank in England, in the United States you will be sure to find an association. I love this last line. Thus, the most democratic country on the face of the earth is that in which men have, in our time, carried to the highest perfection the art of pursuing in common the objective of their common desires, and have applied this new science to the greatest number of purposes. That's what we're all about. That's the why. Why do we come together? Because we have a common interest. You as dealers out there that have given your time and sacrifice to serve on the board of directors have done so because you have a common interest with the members of your association and want to help create a better business environment, to advocate for particular issues that are going to make our business environment better. In order to organize as a 501c6 under the IRS code, which is what trade associations are, we have to have a common interest. We have to have some particular purpose that we're looking to accomplish. And that idea of coming together to better the used car industry fits that purpose. And that's what drives everything that we do. Things that we do at the state level, things that we do at the national level. I just put up here a couple of bullet points from NIADA's mission statement, but I know each one of you at the state level have a particular mission statement and purpose for your state association. So as we keep in mind the things that we do, it all needs to be in furtherance of that particular mission. So what role does the board of directors have in moving the association forward? Steve mentioned that the executive directors, their primary purpose is to preserve the assets and financial stability of the association. You as members of the board are the ones that are designated as driving the purpose of the association, accomplishing its mission, making sure that its goals are reached and achieved. So, a couple things here that came to mind as I was thinking about this. Preserve the mission of your association, making sure that that mission statement is honored and fulfilled and accomplished. Selecting the executive director, ensuring that the association is well managed, both from a financial standpoint, from a personnel standpoint. You're not going to get in the weeds and do the day-to-day stuff that the executive director would do, but you need to make sure that that's being accomplished. Making sure that the association has adequate resources to accomplish its mission. Representing the association to both the non-members, but also to the members of the association. Protect the association from threats, both external and internal. Part of what we're here for is to talk about some of those threats. This afternoon, we'll hear from a lot of the regulatory agencies on what we perceive to be the threats from government, but those threats are real and out there. Protect finances and ensure compliance with the association bylaws. So as a board member, and let me tell you how appreciative of you we are for giving of your time and efforts and energies, volunteering. You all have businesses to run, and we understand how important that is to you and to your families. But we want you to understand what responsibilities you have and legal obligations that you're going to undertake as you volunteer your time and effort. There are 3 fiduciary responsibilities that you are going to assume as you volunteer your time and efforts and energies to further your state association. This idea of fiduciary duty is an implicit responsibility to act on the best interests of the association. That's the legal definition. These 3 duties that you're going to take upon you are the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, and the duty of obedience. The duty of care is defined as the exercising of ordinary and reasonable care in the performance of your duties, and then exhibiting honesty and good faith in accomplishing those duties. So as a member of the board, we've talked about some of those duties that you have to make sure that the association is run correctly and the direction is headed the way that you want it to, and you're out to accomplish this best interest for which you've come together to form an association to begin with. So as you exercise care, you have to make sure that that is happening. How do you do that? You as board members, in order to meet this idea of fiduciary duty of care, have to be actively involved in the decision making of the board. You're the one that sets the tone. You're the one that makes the broad-based decisions that's going to drive the bus down the particular freeway that you want to go down. Now, the executive directors will handle a lot of the day-to-day operational stuff, but in terms of setting the vision and accomplishing things, you're the ones that have to make the decision.
Hey, Sean, real quickly, and I think that's a really good point, and that's one of the things that maybe Mike, Lynn, and we can come back to your deal here in a second, but the relationship that the executive director has with the board is a critical element, and how the board views the role of the executive director and how the executive director views the role of the board, I think is a critical balance in how the association gets managed. Mike, do you have any ideas or maybe some anecdotal stories about how, I mean, we see it all the time where a state executive director is given a lot of leeway, given too much leeway to run the association, and vice versa, where you've got board members who are too overbearing, kind of like helicopter parents, can't let the executive director make any decisions, can't make them sign any contracts without approval or different things like that. Do you have any feedback or thoughts on kind of maintaining that balance?
Yeah, and I'll kind of, a lot of people kind of know me as a storyteller. So a lot of times when I'm trying to explain something, I will pull out some real life experience, something that's happened with one of our state associations or somewhere across the country out there. And let me give you an example. This happened about 5-6 years ago. It's not the first time. We could stay here for 3 days and I could tell you horror stories. And I'm not trying to scare you. But we had a situation in Kansas. The executive director there, she spent most of her time trying to tell her board about the big bad wolf called NIADA, that you shouldn't go to the conventions, you shouldn't communicate with any of those people, the officers, the staff, or whatever. Just let me handle all of that. Well, she did. Those officers there got to where they wouldn't come to anything that we put on, educational training, and I'm not talking about education as to how to be a car dealer. I'm talking about training as to how to run an association management, your responsibilities as a board member or officer. So anyway, they just kind of let her do whatever she wanted to do. And this went on for several years, and you know, over the 26 years I've been doing this, believe me, there's a lot of things I can see out there that tell me immediately that something is really wrong. I don't have to sit down and look at financials at your state association. There's just a lot of signs, a lot of red flags that I can see. Well, I was seeing red flags all over the place. So anyway, the officers of that association, the president, tried to find the executive director one day, and he couldn't find her. He hadn't talked to her in a couple of weeks. So anyway, he went to the office. Couldn't get in. So he got the rest of the board together, so they all went there. They had to actually break into the office. And she was nowhere to be found. They had no money in the bank. They found membership dues checks in her desk. Some of them were 2 years old, to where they weren't even deposited. Now, for somebody that just cleans out, you know, the association's bank account, why would you leave a couple of checks laying there? But anyway, I kind of already knew what she was telling her officers. So I called the president after I found out what was going on up there. And I said, let us help you. No, Mike, I appreciate you calling, but I think we got a handle on it. We're just going to have to figure out where we go from here. And I said, well, I know exactly where you're going to go from here. And if you don't let me help you, I'm not going to be responsible for what happens. So the next thing that they did, they, of course, took a look at everything else coming and going in the association. Tax returns had not been filed for over 3 years. Employment taxes, stuff like that, none of that, 941s, none of that stuff had been filed. So they decided to, you know, pretty much put the association into bankruptcy. Well, that was the wrong thing to do, because the next thing that happened, them trying to file for bankruptcy, filing reports, what had and what hadn't been done, then the IRS gets wind of it. So the IRS came in, they audited the entire situation, and guess what was next? They went after the officers, and they audited the officers. 3 of the guys on the board wound up, after being in business 20 to 30 years, losing their business because they volunteered. But they didn't keep their eye on what was happening. They entrusted everything to one individual, no supervision, no management, no oversight. That's just one of many, many stories I could tell you. So you have to take, and again, just like Steve said, we want you folks to volunteer and be on boards, be the state president, an officer, treasurer, but there are responsibilities that go along with that, and if you don't take it seriously, there can be dire consequences.
And I think that's a great story that really kind of underscores what Sean is talking about in terms of not only the fiduciary responsibility, but the liability that every board member assumes the day you agree to be on the board and to serve on that board. And you know, and I've heard board members talk about this before too, where they're like, oh, well, I was president, you know, 2 or 3 years ago. So I wasn't the treasurer when that whole thing went down, and you know, now I'm not even on the board, and if the IRS or somebody comes poking around today, I'm not even on the board anymore, so I'm not liable. Well, the first thing that's going to happen in the event of an IRS inquiry or an audit or something else, they're going to find out who was in charge of the board at that time. So the current timetable is irrelevant. If you get the letter today talking about something that happened 3 or 4 years ago, they're going to ask and inquire about who was in charge of the board 3 or 4 years ago, not the makeup of the board today, although they will look at that as well. But Mike mentioned something about red flags. And, you know, inevitably, a lot of those red flags point to, you know, erroneous behavior or lackadaisical behavior. And that's really kind of where I want to turn the conversation at this point, is to some of the things that in your positions as elected officers at the state level, the basic things that you can be looking for or hearing about.
The biggest problem that we have is treasurers not digging into financials. When you really, first thing I would advise anybody, and we had a problem, never have an accountant work for your executive. Make sure the contract and the accountant works for the board. He should report and be open and have open access to every board member at all times, because you should be able to call him as a treasurer and say, what is this? And then not call him and him refer you to the executive. So that's a red flag right there. We had that situation. The other thing, thanks to Mike was the one that educated me at a leadership meeting, and that's what I'm here trying to give back. Of the fiduciary responsibilities of Secretary Treasurer, Vice President, President, I had never been informed of that. I didn't know. I had heard some horror stories, but that ain't us. That's not going to happen. When I really started digging into financials and working the financials and found discrepancies, when approached by it, executive usually showed anger. And whenever an executive shows anger and non-cooperation, then you need to be worried, because that means there's something that's really not right. So we started digging into financials, and I found some advertising that was hidden in or really it wasn't advertising, it was a kickback to the NIADA, ADAA in our state, but to the New Car Dealer Association in order to procure their forms business, which our executive was paid on commission on forms business. Never was approved by the board. It was $5,000 a year. That was nearly, at that time, $55,000 been took out of the association. The new car dealers would have bought forms for us anyway. The state commissions us. We were the only source. But this was a payoff to the New Car Association without our knowledge and without the board's knowledge. That's just a part of it. We didn't have D&O insurance. If you don't have D&O insurance, you're at risk. An executive not being less than stellar will avoid having D&O insurance because it puts him accountable. The executive is not accountable under IRS rules. The officers are. So he has D&O insurance. If there was fraudulent behavior, would put him accountable. So our executive deferred us from told us he had researched it, it was way too expensive. So a couple of us board members took it upon ourselves to research it. I mean, it was minuscule. It wasn't much at all for D&O insurance. So we added D&O insurance. The one thing, I don't want to discourage anybody from serving. I think it's the most honorable thing that you can do is serve. I think it's an ability, a way to give back to an industry that has fed you and looked after you. And it's a way to protect it and bring up younger dealers, where they'll have a better environment to work in than we did. That's the whole attitude. But with the position of honor also comes a position of responsibility, and you need to take that responsibility very, very, very serious. It's something you should never be afraid to question financials. I don't know how many of you know, but 501c6 or any nonprofit is open to examination, not by only board members or members, but by any individual who wants to come in and look at the records. You have to open your books. If the IRS is going to grant you the status of being a nonprofit, then you've got to make anything available to the public to ensure that your nonprofit status is a viable situation, that they're paying the taxes for you, the public is. So they're open. So any of the books is open to any member or any citizen that wants to come into a nonprofit. That's something that can be done. The main thing that You should also keep in mind when you do have an executive is to set policy. Because you have access, don't micromanage. Does that mean that if an executive doesn't call you for advice, he should call you for advice and maybe as a sounding board? Don't make his decision for him. Let him run the day-to-day operation. Keep your board focused on managing, setting policy only and policy for the association. Leave the day-to-day to the executive and stay out of it. Best advice that I can give you. But don't take everything that an executive says, trust but verify. If you don't trust him, you don't need him working for you. That's the bottom line. This is your organization, it's not his. You wouldn't turn any employee loose in any business without verifying what they're doing. If you had an employee managing something for you, you trust them or you wouldn't have them there managing. But you still go behind and make sure that everything's the way it should be. You should do the same thing with your associations, state associations.
That's a good point. So just as a matter of practically speaking, some red flags that could pop up on the radar screen, and again, these aren't always 100% conclusive, or if something like this exists, that it's an indication of a major problem or even a minor problem. But I think you should all be getting at least copies of a budget. Everybody gets copies of a budget, like to plan and forecast association activities. Budgets, anyone? Okay. So budgets, making sure obviously your tax returns get filed. Are you guys seeing your tax returns before they get filed? Because I know that is a tactical issue that state associations have where the executive director may be able or may be allowed to sign off on the tax returns. It's typically a good idea to have either the president or your secretary or treasurer sign off on those tax returns. The executive can't sign off on them, but the bigger point is before those get filed and signed off on, you as a board need to review those. And I know that's some liability that the executive director, or if you want to clarify that.
The IRS now requires that before the tax returns are signed and filed, that the officers of the association must view them. That's an IRS reg. That just came about in the last couple of years.
So, and that's a good point. So I think it's important for you guys as board members to obviously see these returns before they get signed and filed. The other thing for fraud to exist is three things have to be present for fraud to exist. You have to have motive, you have to have opportunity, and you have to have lack of oversight. So if those three things exist, it doesn't mean that fraud exists. It just means that there's a really good opportunity for fraud to evolve from those operational procedures. So go back and look at your internal cash controls. Look at who's opening the mail, who's making the deposits, who's receiving your bank statements. And it's a good idea, a good practice to make sure that your treasurer is receiving a copy of your bank statement monthly. If you can, and if you have an outside accountant that maybe works with your association to reconcile the bank statement to your check activity, make sure that your outside accounting firm isn't also the same company doing your audit, because that could be a small conflict of interest there. But just generally a good practice. How many of you guys are going through an annual either budget or an audit or a review of your financial statements? Okay. Sometimes it's an issue of cash flow. I mean, annual audits are expensive. Reviews are a little less expensive. They're a little less intrusive. They're certainly not forensic by any nature. But if you're not doing an audit, at least consider doing a review every couple of years, and then bite the bullet, once every 3 or 4 years to do, a full scale audit. Some states that are very well run do, a review, an audit, or 2 years of a review, 1 year of an audit, 2 years review, 1 year of an audit. but have some kind of pattern there at the state level to, make sure that you've got outside eyes taking a look at what's happening internally. So again, just because those three things may exist doesn't mean fraud exists. And like I said, just because you're getting financial statements, you could go through an audit and see that there's a lot of things that you could be doing a lot better. So at this point, let me just open it up for questions. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts or concerns or maybe things that you're seeing at the state level that you want to ask us about? I mean, again, we could talk about this stuff all day long, but like I said, we want to be a resource for you guys as well. Any questions?
What type of contracts would you let the executive director enter into?
Well, sometimes that's dictated by the bylaws. Bylaws may dictate in some cases that the executive director has full signing authority on behalf of the association. Sometimes it's a shared responsibility where the executive director, the board of directors, or the executive committee as three separate entities have the ability to enter into a contract. So it's maybe dictated by your own bylaws. And that's, go ahead.
As I say, I think from a general rule of thumb too, to the extent that your bylaws aren't very specific about that, things that set policy would be contracts that the board's got to sign off on. Things that are the day-to-day operational type things, I think would be things that an executive director should do and can do without any problem. Signing the lease agreement, getting the internet hookup, those sorts of things. But things that are going to be a policy-driven, mission-driven related concept are things that the board's going to want to have to sign off on and should sign off on.
It's a good question, though. How many state associations here are being run by direct employees? In other words, your executive director is an employee of the association. How many are, okay, so a good bit of you. How many are being run by a contract that you have with a management company? Okay. That's a whole other topic of discussion in terms of, what's the best opportunity for your state association as it relates to running the day-to-day operations. I mean, there's pros and cons to both. Management companies are a good way to run the association, but direct employees are as well. So just wanted to kind of get a feel for that. In terms of other kind of good red flags to kind of look at, in conversations with our own audit firm, the advice that Reggie Parr, who is our auditor, suggested was, take a look at how involved your board is. And keep in mind, the guy that does our audit, he does audits for a number of trade associations, not only at the national level, but at the state level as well. And he said his feedback was inevitably looking at all of the associations that he reviews and he looks at, inevitably an uninvolved board at the association level is a big cause for concern. Again, not an indication that something is definitely wrong, but it's, again, where there's smoke, there may be fire. So an uninvolved board, financials that aren't being delivered in a current manner, and then also looking for a treasurer who has an inclination towards finance. So if you've got a treasurer who can barely add with a calculator, probably not a good idea to keep that guy in charge of your checkbook and the fiduciary responsibility of your association. But look for people who have an inclination to the numbers guys among us. Like Chris Martin, who is our current chairman. He's a finance major. He's always been good with numbers. But additionally, for us at the national level, we've got Charles Teal, who over and above our executive committee and our treasurer, he actually reviews our financial statements on a monthly basis. And we actually have 3 different companies, and so he looks at all the activity of all 3 companies and puts kind of a consolidated report together that, measures different efficiencies and operational objectives. But he's kind of the beautiful mind on our board of, numbers and equations, and you can just look at this guy and know that he's trying to solve for X somewhere, So he's a great resource for us. And then making sure that your IRS filings are current. The Form 990, the IRS has made a lot of changes to that form in the last few years. If you're not familiar with the 990, I would recommend, taking a look at it. Lots of fun stuff.
Steve, there's one other red flag that we haven't talked about yet, and not to get back to the PowerPoint per se, but I do think it's an important thing to bring up, if it'll go there, is the idea of conflicts of interest. One of the things as board members that you'll need to be very cognizant of is the potential for conflicts of interest, not only between you and the association. Part of your fiduciary duty of loyalty is that you're going to act within the best interest of the association. Does that mean that you have to harm your business? Of course not. But in making decisions for the association's best interests have to be in mind. Conflicts of interest can come up in lots of different ways, and for whatever reason this is not working. Oh, there we go. So, they can come up in employment context, it can come up in contract context, it can come up in a lot of different ways. You also need to be cognizant of potential conflicts of interest that other board members may have with the association. In the legal field, we have this ethical duty that if we're aware of somebody that's violating one of our codes of canons, we're actually supposed to be the tattletales and take it to the disciplinary council or to the Supreme Court or whomever you report to. Kind of like you're going back to second grade again, but in order to be compliant with your fiduciary duty of loyalty, you have to be aware of those situations, and if there's something that looks bad or smells bad, you may have to do a little bit more digging. You may have to, inquire with that board member as to what is going on here to avoid the conflicts of interest that would potentially put the association in conflict with that particular individual or yourself.
Yeah. And I think you raise a good point. I'm gonna come back to Dan here in a second, who has been, just loquacious this morning. This is the $10 word. You can Google it. But one of the things that Sean raises is the idea of continuity, and continuity of leadership. I think is a big challenge and a big topic that I think our state associations need to be thinking about. Again, tying back to the statement that I made earlier, that if you look at the scope of our state association network across the country, you've got varying degrees of life cycle all over the place. You've got state executive directors who've been around for 20, 25, 30 years, which is great. You've got other state associations that have people who've been at the helm for a month or less than a month. In Ohio's case, she started on November the 1st. But the point is, they just went through a major transition with somebody who was running their association for 20 plus years and found themselves in a situation, not because of any kind of financial impropriety, but found themselves in a situation where they needed to replace their executive director. So part of your responsibility as a board is not only to think about the financial implications of the reporting and board governance and those things, but part of your responsibility as a board to think about things that are happening now, but also things that are going to be happening in the future, and be forward thinking about who's going to be running your association in the future, and talk about and start thinking about a succession plan for the people who are running your state associations as executive directors. And again, it may not be relevant today or tomorrow or in the next 5 or 6 or 10 years, but you at least need to start thinking about it in the event that if something does come up, you've at least got a plan or have had a conversation about it to move forward. And speaking of that transition, Dan, I don't know if you want to take a couple of minutes and maybe
Sure.
talk about what you guys just went through in Ohio and the process to replace that leader.
That was very interesting. Actually, it's a lot of responsibility we're talking about today. I actually joined the association to go golfing at the golf outing and drink some beers with my friends. I didn't know I had this much responsibility, but actually, this past couple of years for the Ohio Association has been kind of crazy. Jim Mitchell, most of you guys know who he is, and he was a great director. But one of the blessings in disguise in this whole situation is it brought the board together. It made us actually look at our procedures, our policies. Some of the people really stepped up, but there's a lot of areas that we were completely clueless about. I mean, typically board members we go down to Columbus and we spend 4 days a year down there to, you know. I probably spent about 3 weeks, and at least this year in Columbus, going over all the stuff. I mean, it's opened our eyes, and it's helped us. Having that succession plan is huge. I mean, Mike Lynn told me that 2 years ago. Have a succession plan. I didn't think anything of it, and I kind of kicked myself in the butt. That would have been huge. But anyways, it really just having the procedures and policies in place to get everything in order, it's vital. We went through, we actually hired an individual to run the association, and then the state of Ohio came back and offered him quite a bit more than we did, so that was a whole 2-week term. And but it was a process that I'm glad it's in the past. We're looking forward to moving on. But.
Yeah. So it's an important issue, and like I said, it may not be relevant today or tomorrow, but it's something that as board members you should be thinking about. In terms of just maintaining that continuity of flow, kind of like what we're trying to do with our elected officers and making sure that as you're coming up through the channels that you've got a good feel for what the roles and responsibilities are that you're about to take on as you ascend into higher leadership with the association and beyond. So I mean, we can talk about this stuff for days, like Mike said, and tell you horror stories. Before we wrap it up, does anybody have any kind of final questions or thoughts or concerns? It's an open forum, so no. And I think that's a great point, and we've seen that at the state level too, where things were happening in the office that the staff knew about, but were afraid to say anything to board members or to the higher ups, and everybody should have a personnel and policy procedures manual that governs the kind of employment behavior of the state association and all of the employees. And, there should be clearly listed grievance policies and, things, reporting procedures, and, just like in the case of a harassment situation, if the person harassing me is my boss, I can't go to my boss and tell them that they're harassing me. I got to go up the channel and start finding the next available person to talk to. But I think that's a great point, and you got to keep an open dialogue not only with your executive director but the staff as well, because the staff can give you some pretty good insight. That's a good question.
Steve, can I make one point?
You sure can.
You brought it up, and I meant to bring it up when you asked me. And I know nobody raised their hand for a management contract with state executives. One of the biggest problems we've had, if you ever get to replace, like Dan has just done in Ohio, if you ever have to replace an executive, my advice to anybody that serves on a state level is make the executive an employee of the association. The only way a management contract works is if they manage more than one association. If they've got several associations that they work, we've got one situation like that, they do a great job. He manages 4 or 5 different associations. But one of the problems that we had a management contract with our executive. When a preferred vendor comes in and wants to sign up with your association and wants to give to the association in order to make it more viable and then be a part of it, which is a good marriage and a good relationship. A lot of times we found that a lot of and we discovered it on several occasions, was the executive was switching the endorsement to his management company. So the funds was coming into his management company instead of coming into the association. If you think that you're saving money by paying a executive through a management corporation and he is only managing your business, you're kidding yourself. It's costing you more than what you're paying them. So that would be one thing that if you change executives and you go, do not enter into, my advice, now that's just my opinion of what I've been through. My advice would be not to enter into a management contract and have him a direct employee of your state association.
That's a good point. And it's the subject of a lot of debate. I mean, we see it all the time. We've seen impropriety happen with management companies that are running a state association, but we've also seen impropriety with a direct employee who's running the state association as well. So, you know, I could tell you horror stories on both examples. I would share the same sentiment with Henry. I've seen situations where a state association has a couple of really good direct employees running their association, and then at some point they decide, hey, let's form a separate company, have the association rehire us as a management firm, and then we can run the association at the same time we're running our management firm. And they, in this particular case, they convinced the board to do that. And in my opinion, and again, based on what was happening specifically in this state at the time, in my opinion, as soon as the board agreed to do that, a conflict of interest arose. Not because of any specific conflict of interest that they had contractually or what have you, but in my opinion, a conflict of interest arose because whereas the week before the board hired them as a management company, they were waking up every day thinking about what's in the best interest of the association. And the day that they agreed to become a management company, have them run the association, now the guys who are running the association may look at a situation or an opportunity and say, a week ago we probably would have gone this way, but we have to consider maybe, you know, what's in the best interest of the association, but our management company could benefit by this, you know, thing as well, and we can both benefit. So again, not to say one over another in any particular reason, but, you know, it's a case-by-case basis, for sure. But I think that's a good point. We absolutely do have a policy and procedures manual that we use to govern our staff activity, and if anybody ever wants a copy of that or copies of, you know, executive director job descriptions or financial accountability, you know, policy and procedures, any of that stuff, any of the stuff that we have at the national level can be used at the state level. If you want to modify it a little, change, you know, take out NIADA, put your names in there, we're completely fine with that. It's a good point. Any other final questions?
I just have actually a thought. Mr. Molinek said to, you know, be involved. And the one thing that I would suggest is we have, as most of us are board members, you have 4 meetings a year. One thing that I did in our vice president this past 2 years, we made our presence a lot more visible in the office. And that changes a perspective. So, I mean, if you get the opportunity, I'm 3 hours from our association headquarters, so it's a little difficult, but if you got board members within the area, just stopping in, asking for stuff, you know, what are you working on? I mean, think of your employees, and you walk in, all of a sudden you see them pushing a broom. I mean, it's important to be seen, because if not, that's when things could possibly get out of control. So it's huge to consider that.
Yeah.